Welcome back, everybody. I'm back with my good friend Olivia to talk a little bit more about health because we had a great recording last time and we got off our call and just thought, wow, that was great, but we could probably hone it in. We could reel it in a little bit more and talk about
Mm-hmm.
topics. I mentioned to you all who read the newsletter that Olivia is vastly knowledgeable in a lot of things. And so I figured, why don't we spend a couple different newsletters breaking down each of those things?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to talk to you, Olivia, today about hormones because that was something we touched on last time we spoke. And I realized, you realized as well that that was a rabbit hole that we could go down a whole episode with.
So
And
much to know.
and so I want to know a little bit about, in your practice as a functional nutritionist. Do I have that right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What do you see? Why do people come to you? What are the men and women? What are the hormone kind of irregularities that you see
Mm-hmm.
that you think people should know about or be more aware about?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the I mean, really our hormonal system, our endocrine system can impact nearly every function in our body. So if we're seeing like maybe abnormal weight gain without having changed our diet or exercise, that can definitely be attributed to hormones. And it's different for men and women too. Some
Right.
common things I see in my practice for women specifically who are experiencing like any kind of hormonal imbalance, but specifically like with reproductive hormones like estrogen or progesterone or testosterone or even like thyroid and cortisol. A lot of what I see is like irregular periods or PMS symptoms like really heavy cramping, irritability, mood swings, anxiety, insomnia, all of that, all of those like common symptoms that a lot of women experience, especially during certain points in their cycle, can be attributed to hormonal imbalance.
Right.
Again, weight gain, abnormal weight gain specifically, or unexplained weight gain, if somebody has not made any like changes in their lifestyle, but they're seeing just the pounds pack on, so to speak, that could be attributed specifically to, I mean, all of our hormones, but really like cortisol and thyroid hormones. What else? Low energy can definitely be attributed to hormones for women, poor sex drive, brain fog. I mentioned fatigue. All of those things can be attributed to hormonal imbalances. And then for men, it's different too. I mean, a lot of the time, what I see, what's really, really common for men when they're experiencing a hormonal imbalance or a fluctuation of some sort. It could be like low sex drive. I see
Yeah.
that a lot. Low libido. That is a lot of men experience that when they're like when they have hormonal imbalances, especially with testosterone. We might see like muscle atrophy is a big thing too
Wow.
for men with hormonal imbalance. And then again, there's some overlap with what women experience. So like there could be fatigue, brain
Yeah.
fog, abnormal weight gain, but those are some common things that men tend to see.
Now I'm curious because I feel like this might be a controversial question, but do you feel like one group is more between men and women are more disadvantaged than the other? I am a little biased on this, and maybe you can back me up here, but I tend to think women have it a little harder. I think some of the stuff we talked about on our last episode, from a ultra processed food standpoint, uh, a birth control standpoint, some of the stuff that um, some of the ways that women's bodies react to these things make it a lot tougher for women to really nail down.
For
But
sure.
what do you think? Do you think it's kind of an even split 50-50, or might one group have it harder than the other?
Yeah. I wish I could say it was an even split, but in reality, women definitely do tend to suffer more.
Yeah.
And that's a whole conversation. We could even go back or like, zoom out rather and say like that's, a lot of like societal or collective issue, but the reality is too like our physiology is just a lot more sensitive. We have higher estrogen and progesterone, and these hormones really play a big role in like maintaining equilibrium when it comes to weight and libido and like even regulating moods. And so, yeah, to answer your question, definitely women have it harder, so to speak, or maybe we're just more sensitive to our hormones. And we also, our hormones cycle differently than men's do. So
Right.
women run on average on like a 28-day cycle. So what that means is over the span of 28 days, our estrogen, our testosterone, our progesterone, and then we have two ovulatory hormones, LH and FSH, they're
Mm.
constantly in flux. So if we're to look at our hormones on like a 28-day graph, we see estrogen, for example, is, well, all of our hormones really within the first week of our cycle are on the lower side, then everything starts to creep up. And this is how it's like supposed to look, right? When there's an endocrine or hormonal imbalance, we might see fluctuations at different points when we're not supposed to. But then as we near the middle of our cycle during ovulation, everything starts to come up and then we see a dip again. And then into our luteal phase, or the 2 weeks leading up to our menstrual cycle, we see progesterone come up, estrogen comes up as well. And progesterone is actually supposed to be 300 times higher than estrogen during that point.
Wow.
So this is like the natural sort of cadence that our hormones take as women over like a 28-day cycle, whereas men have fluctuations every 24 hours. So like they have their testosterone peak at a within a 24-hour period, and that happens every day. So it's like just
Wow.
more predictable. And I would say, I mean, testosterone can be heavily influenced by what's going on in our environment, what we're eating, what toxins we're exposed to. But estrogen is going to be more influenced by our environment because we're so exposed to just inevitably. And, I don't want to like be an alarmist in any way, but we're so exposed to like xenoestrogens and like BPAs in plastic and BPA analogs like BPP, and these things bind to estrogen receptors in our body and can mimic estrogen in our system.
Yeah.
And yeah, that puts women at higher risk for having hormonal imbalances, unfortunately.
I believe it. Well, that backs up my thesis for sure. I did not
Yeah.
know. I learned something today. I did not know that men's hormones cycled on a 24-hour period. I assumed it was definitely quicker than women's, but that's really fast. Maybe I should have known that. I don't know. I'm curious to go a little bit more in depth into the specific hormones. Um,
Yeah.
LH, FSH, all ones you mentioned. People listening might not know much about those. Testosterone, estrogen, a lot of people are familiar with progesterone as well, but talk to me about like the groups, like a group them into, reproductive and, just general, like their functions and, give me like kind of quick explainers on each of
Yeah.
them and maybe what influences them too, aside from just the environmental stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So I love I love giving this education or doing this education with my women clients, especially because it's so important and there's just not enough education on like our hormones and again the natural like fluctuations that women experience on a monthly basis and like the role that these hormones play and when they're out of balance, like what we might experience. And so I'll start with estrogen. So we have actually three different forms of estrogen in our system.
Okay.
So we have E1, E2, and E3. And so that's estriol is actually E3. Estrone is E1, I believe. And then estradiol is E2.
Hmm.
And so estradiol, E2, is actually our most biologically active form of estrogen in our system.
Hmm.
And so when you go to the doctor, when a woman it goes to like her OBGYN and gets her hormones tested, they do a blood draw, they're measuring estradiol because that's the most biologically active form of estrogen in our system.
Right.
And so estrogen is a very feminine hormone. So it's like what gives women their curves. It helps with like libido and vaginal lubrication. It helps with motivation. It's like kind of what gets women going, during the day. It helps with like, yeah, just motivation, helps to keep you happy. It's a very like active hormone, I would say. Unfortunately, like I had mentioned previously, there's so many things in our modern society and our environment that can negatively influence estrogen, particularly like toxins and chemicals in our skincare, in our water supply, in our beauty products. Plastic is a huge one. There's things within plastic that can bind to estrogen receptors like BPA, for example, and these are called xenoestrogens. And so they negatively influence estrogen in our system. They can cause like a pseudo estrogen peak. And so when estrogen is imbalanced, what a woman might experience is like abnormal weight gain would be a big one. irregular periods, heavy bleeding, heavy cramping, maybe like sore breasts around her period, again, like heavy cramping, infertility. A lot of these things can be attributed to poor estrogen detoxification. But there's things that can be done about it. Obviously, we want to do the best we can to avoid. It's so it's so hard just with the way our world is set up, but doing the best we can to avoid in excess at least like plastics or chemicals in our products, buying organic food when we can, drinking filtered water, all of those things can make a big difference. And then from a food perspective, fiber overall is really, really helpful for detoxing excess estrogens from our system. There's a couple foods in particular that have like really potent estrogen detoxifying effects. So like cruciferous vegetables like broccoli sprouts, cauliflower, bok choy, Brussels sprouts, all of the crucifers, cabbage is another one too. All of those can play a really big role in helping with estrogen detox in our liver. They're really high in sulforaphane and a compound called DIM, which help to basically open up our liver detoxification pathways to allow for more efficient detoxification of estrogen.
Two questions
So
for you on estrogen,
yeah,
not to cut you off,
yeah,
but
no worries.
when you are talking about estrogen detoxification, those things you all mentioned all sound like they positively influence it. When you is there, I would guess this is probably a yes, but is there such a thing as too much estrogen? I know you said those things negatively influence it. Does that mean they lead to a drop in estrogen, or could it lead to a drop or spike? Are both of those things negative?
Yes, both of those things are negative for
Yeah.
sure. When I say these things in our environment that I'm specifically referring to, they negatively influence estrogen in the sense that they increase estrogen. So they're
No.
binding to estrogen receptors and increasing the amount of estrogen. Again, it's fake estrogen in a way, it's pseudo estrogen, but they bind to estrogen receptors and increase estrogen in our system.
Got it.
And so, yeah, that can lead to all of those things I just mentioned. Low estrogen is like a separate problem. Of course, we see the effects of that a lot in like perimenopause and menopausal women, but women who are on hormonal birth control can experience low estrogen too, just naturally. So that's kind of a separate thing. But yeah, what I'm referring to is the increase in estrogen.
My second question is, you mentioned that estradiol, specifically E2, is predominantly responsive for like libido in women. Do I have that right?
Yeah,
Does
plays a big role.
would that also have a similar role for men too? I feel like it would, right? Or maybe not as much.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. I mean, men definitely have a smaller amount of estrogen in their body, but they do have estrogen in their system. I mean, when it comes to libido, that's also certainly very multifactorial when it comes to like having a healthy libido. But estrogen definitely plays a role for men, but testosterone too can play
Yeah.
a big role.
I feel like that's a good segue into testosterone. Maybe you want to
Yeah,
break that down a little bit, the influence there,
yeah,
how it affects
yeah.
people.
Yeah, so it's actually really interesting since we're like in this space talking about estrogen and segueing into testosterone. So estrogen is actually created from testosterone in our body via a process called aromatization, which requires like a couple different enzymes and different like nutrients. So that's an interesting fact.
Aromatization, aroma, I think, smell. Does it have anything to do with that?
No, no. It more so has to do with the fact that there's like an aromatase enzyme. That's the enzyme that's involved in like doing the actual conversion.
Got it.
So yeah, that's a
Cool.
good question. Yeah, testosterone is a very, very important hormone. It's obviously found within men in greater quantities. Testosterone is responsible for like building healthy muscle mass. It helps with, yeah, again, similar to what estrogen does. It can help with motivation. It can help with like cognitive function. It helps with, or it plays a role or has its own role in like blood sugar regulation because insulin and testosterone have a very intimate relationship. Oftentimes, when we're speaking about women's hormones and women's health with testosterone, a lot of the time when we have too much testosterone, that can be a big problem and a common problem, which is why I'm bringing it up, specifically in a condition called polycystic ovarian syndrome,
Oh yeah.
or PCOS, that one of the underlying metabolic imbalances, or not metabolic imbalances, but hormonal imbalances with PCOS is women tend to have too much testosterone
Right.
with that. So that can cause like hirsutism, which is just abnormal hair growth in places that women shouldn't be seeing hair, like on their chest or above their lip, or on their chin or their jawline. That can contribute to oily skin and oily scalp, hair loss, acne, blood sugar imbalances, since we know insulin is androgenic or contributes to the release of testosterone. So, very important hormone, but also when it's imbalanced, it can contribute to a lot of those negative symptoms that we don't want.
Yeah, for sure. So is it fair to say that in men, low testosterone is a worse problem than high testosterone, and in women, high testosterone is worse than low? Or is that too cut and dry?
Yeah, no, I think that, yeah, that is pretty accurate. You know, it's more common, I think, with our environment and our food supply and just the world we live in. It's more common for men to have lower testosterone than they should.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely more of a common problem than having too much testosterone. And then, yeah, it's kind of the opposite. We see that inversely with women. Like women tend to experience higher testosterone than they should have in this modern world that we live in. So yeah, I never thought about that, but yeah, that is true.
Yeah, trying to make it digestible. I feel like those are questions
Yeah,
I get a lot, and it's like, well,
yeah,
it's not probably not a bad thing if it's low, if it's a girl, but like, okay, it'll be too low.
yeah,
I
yeah.
want to
Definitely
talk
can be too
about
low for women too.
I want to talk about a few more. I know there's probably a few on your list, but maybe in terms of the hierarchy, in terms of like what you think is the next most, if you
Yeah,
consider
yeah,
FSH, which one would you do
yeah.
next?
Well, I think while we're talking about the reproductive hormones, we should definitely talk about progesterone.
Hmm.
This is a really, really, really important hormone. We see it frequently low in women.
Hmm.
There's a lot of nutrients that play a role in boosting progesterone production, like zinc and vitamin E. There's a lot of medicinal foods that women can work in to help boost progesterone. So I like to think about progesterone and estrogen as, and this is, I'm paraphrasing actually from a very popular functional medicine hormone doctor. Her name is Sarah Gottfried. She's brilliant, and I've read a couple of her books. But she describes progesterone and estrogen as sort of like dancing in tango with one another. So they don't necessarily have like a direct inverse relationship, but they are certainly influenced by one another. In somewhat of an inverse fashion. And so this is interesting to think about when women are in the second half of their cycle. So this is the 2 weeks leading up to their menstrual cycle. So this is after they ovulate.
Right.
Again, as I mentioned, progesterone is supposed to be 300 times higher than estrogen,
Yeah.
specifically between days 19 through 22.
Mm.
A lot of women, many women, don't experience that peak in progesterone. And that's because, again, there's a lot of estrogen mimicking compounds in our environment. And so that can cause actually an increase in estrogen, and maybe we might see as a result of that a lower or decrease in progesterone. And so, contrary to estrogen, progesterone is actually the hormone that is responsible for keeping us calm. It's like a very calming hormone. It's grounding. It binds to GABA receptors. It helps women not feel anxious. It helps women sleep really well. Yeah, it's responsible for just feeling like feelings of calmness and happiness. And as we can imagine, if we have low progesterone compared to estrogen, a lot of women experience anxiety, insomnia as a result of having an imbalance of these two hormones, specifically in their luteal phase. So you might hear women these days like say, "Oh, I'm feeling very luteal." Like my friends and I say that sometimes just as a joke, like if we're in our luteal phase, because a lot of women experience symptoms around like the week leading up to their period or 2 weeks leading up to their period. And it's because progesterone should be high, estrogen should be not low, but relatively low compared to progesterone. And that's not always the case.
Right.
And so there's a couple of things we can do, like eat excess fiber. Not pumpkin seeds, but sesame seeds and sunflower seeds are really good to eat during this time to help boost progesterone and lower estrogen. Inositol is another thing I like to use in my practice that can be really helpful. Progesterone is very, very important, equally as important. And a lot of women experience low progesterone in their luteal phase.
Before we switch hormones, does progesterone have a role in the male body? And if so, does it kind of tango like it tangos with estrogen with testosterone or no?
Not with testosterone. And yes, there is definitely progesterone in the male body, just in a lot smaller quantities.
Right.
So men don't feel the effects of progesterone as they're not as sensitive to it as women are.
Mm.
So to answer your question, yes, but just to a lower degree.
And it won't necessarily be the same ratio as a woman's, or will it? Will it still be 300 to, or I guess that's depending on your phases, right? So that would be irrelevant, right?
Yeah, you mean for men?
Yeah.
Yeah, men don't experience that in the way that women do. Yeah, just for women
Good to know.
in our luteal phase.
Yeah.
We're so
Um,
lucky.
I was gonna say you guys have a very complex cocktail of things going on there. All
Yeah.
right, what would you say? Are we moving on from reproductive, or are there still some more reproductive ones we haven't gotten to?
Well, I guess just to wrap up with progesterone, I just wanted to mention, just to make this like tangible for the listeners or readers, a lot of the time if I see a woman and she's giving me symptoms like she's saying, "Oh, my periods are getting shorter, my cycles are getting shorter," or I'm having a hard time getting pregnant, or I'm experiencing a lot of irritability or rage or mood swings or swelling, bloatingness, swelling, bloating,
Yeah.
anxiety, insomnia leading up to her period, like a week and a half or 2 weeks leading up, to me, that is an automatic sign that her progesterone could be off.
Mhm.
That could be that she has low progesterone, and we need to support progesterone production during that second half of the cycle. But also, it could be that she's experiencing too much estrogen too, and we need to work on estrogen detoxification. Sometimes it's both. Most of the time, it's both, I would say. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that in case that's helpful for any of the women listening, because a lot of women experience those symptoms leading up to their period, and a lot of the time it's debilitating.
Right.
So focusing on eating a lot of fiber, like I mentioned, inositol can be helpful. Definitely speaking with a practitioner and getting tested. That would be the first step.
I don't want
Yeah,
to steal your show here because you're crushing it with
no
the
worries.
explanations. We also have about 8 minutes left, so I want to get through all of
Okay.
them. With the next category of hormones, let's say cortisol, FSH, and LH, are those we call those adrenal hormones? Is that correct or no?
Yeah, that's a good question. So FSH and LH are actually they're actually reproductive
They are
hormones
reproductive.
too.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Tell me about them.
there's not as much to say when it comes to like general symptoms, at least what I see in my practice, because these are ovulatory hormones. So a
Mhm.
lot of them are involved in ovulation. You're going to see an LH surge after ovulation, and that's a sign of like healthy ovulation.
Got it.
And just to clarify, ovulation is the time in a woman's cycle, particularly mid-cycle, and it only occurs for 24 hours, and that's when we have the release of the egg to
Mm.
fertilize sperm to get pregnant. So this is the only time of the month that a woman can get pregnant. Of course, they say be careful 3 days after and 3 days before if you're not wanting to get pregnant,
Right.
because sperm can live inside a woman's body for 3 days. So again, we see a spike of all of our hormones, basically all of our reproductive hormones: progesterone, testosterone, estradiol, and then LH and FSH during ovulation. And
Mm.
so again, there's less to say, just because they mostly play a role in like ovulation and fertility
Got it.
and pregnancy.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about, real quick, cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine. What have you got on those?
Yeah. So yeah, so we have our adrenal hormones, cortisol being probably the most popular. So our adrenals are two organs. They sit on top of our kidneys, and they're responsible for the production of DHEA. Of course, there's a small amount of DHEA produced in our reproductive organs as well, but DHEA is mostly produced in our adrenals. And then, yeah, we have norepinephrine, epinephrine, we have adrenaline, but then we have cortisol, which is released from our adrenals as well. Cortisol gets such a bad rap. Most people probably do have too much cortisol, but cortisol is actually really, really important for a lot of different things in our system. And if we're looking at our cortisol on a 24-hour graph, and we get this a lot with hormone testing, specifically with the Dutch, we get to see the 24-hour cortisol curve. What we see, or what is normal and natural and healthy, is to see a cortisol spike first thing in the morning within 30 to 60 minutes of waking up. You want to have that cortisol spike first thing in the morning because cortisol is energizing. That's what gives us our energy, our motivation for the day. And it's specifically energizing in the way that it helps with glucose mobilization. So cortisol actually stimulates the production of glucose via a process called gluconeogenesis in our liver. And that's like that's like an adaptive biological process. Like if we're starving, for example, or there's a famine, there's not a lot of food around, that's going to cause stress, that's going to cause a release of cortisol from our adrenals, and then that's going to help with like keeping us alive and getting us glucose via, again, gluconeogenesis through our liver. So cortisol is really, really, really important. But yeah, again, just going back to the modern person and how we live, most people do have too much cortisol. At least that's what I see in my practice. It's common. It can be common for people to have low cortisol too, specifically in the context of like adrenal fatigue. Like if they went through a really traumatic experience, or if they went through a long period of like prolonged high intensity stress, we might see that cortisol like flatlined, and a lot of people experience like low energy from that, depression, like brain fog, inability to focus, that sort of thing. But yeah, again, cortisol is really important. Sometimes we see it low, sometimes we see it elevated, and there's a lot of things that can help with like elevated cortisol too. So if you're, well, I guess some symptoms of that, just to start there, would be, let's see, stress, anxiety, overwhelm,
Things we
which a lot
know,
of
things we're
people,
aware of.
yeah, things most people experience at least to some capacity.
Right.
And yeah, some helpful ways to help with cortisol balance, and some ways to help nurture your adrenals in a sense is protein is huge, again, because there's that glucose connection with cortisol. So we don't want to be eating foods that are like constantly spiking our blood sugar or spiking our insulin, like refined carbohydrates and things like that. We want to make sure we're getting plenty of protein to nurture our adrenals and keep our blood sugar nice and stable, because that impacts cortisol. There's a couple different plants that I really love, a couple different what are called adaptogens, which are herbs that basically adapt to like your cortisol. So for example, if your cortisol is low, there's a couple adaptogens that can help raise it. Like rhodiola is one of my favorite adaptogens to use for burnout for low cortisol. And then we have something like ashwagandha, which can really help with like having too much cortisol, that can help to lower it and help with stress and anxiety and overwhelm. Electrolytes are huge too, for specifically for like adrenal fatigue or burnout, because electrolytes are really helpful. Sodium in particular is actually really helpful for like keeping cortisol in your blood.
Wow.
So it can be really helpful for like cortisol production, and yeah, helping cortisol to like stick, so to speak. What else? I feel like there's so much to say about cortisol.
I almost want to give it its own episode next time we meet, because I feel like
Yeah,
there's a little bit more to talk about.
yeah,
I agree. It's super important. I'm always telling people like, hey, it's not the end of the world if you're feeling like your cortisol's high. Like it probably needs to be high and then peak
yeah.
off just like any other hormone. But the
Hmm.
last couple minutes here, because I feel like that would be probably the best case scenario, is to maybe take a deep dive on the adrenal hormones next episode.
Yeah.
Um, Tell me how often and I think we can close out on this note. How often is it that somebody will need to go the supplement route versus the whole foods route when it comes to treating everything we just talked about? Is it pretty common, or maybe not as common as we think?
Yeah, yeah. It's it's hard to say because well, it's not hard to say. I guess I just want to preface by saying that there's a lot of like nuances when it comes to treating different hormonal imbalances. So there's a lot of different ways this can go. I would say foundationally, it is a non-negotiable for somebody if they're experiencing any kind of hormonal imbalance to be eating primarily whole foods. That's only going to be supportive, and that should be like a non-negotiable foundational thing that someone with a hormonal imbalance of any sort is doing, because that's only going to be supportive, as I mentioned.
Right.
Supplements, 98% of the time are warranted. I think the reality is, I mean, of course, there's different herbs and botanicals that can be really supportive that we can work in, but also on the other hand, there's a lot of like there's been a lot of depletion. I'm just like thinking about the best way to articulate this.
Right.
There's been a lot of like depletion in our soil overall. Just again, to zoom out and think like high level, our food just is not as nutrient dense as it used to be. And that has a lot to do with like pesticides and just the way we treat the environment. Soil has been depleted of nutrients. When food is grown in the soil, it gets its nutrients from the soil. And so that's really the foundation of like all nutrients. And like that's how humans get their nutrients from the food that they eat.